We are taking a break from our normal programming to enjoy the holidays. But in the meantime, Speculative Sandbox presents the 12 Days of Tropes. Each episode is a secret until you open it, just like a present. And who knows, maybe you'll see one of these tropes fully analyzed with a guest in the future.
Anyone else really struggling to keep up with the House of the Dragon names? So there's a Viserys, and a baby Viserys, not to mention a Lucerys, and an Aegon. Not this Aegon, and not to be confused with Aemond. Kind of sounds like Daemon, and who are not elves. And then there's Rhaenyra, and a Rhaenyra, I think, and a Baela, and a Laena, and a Laenor, which is the male Laena, and a Joffrey, but it's a different Joffrey even though there's a Joffrey later. How do we do this?
That was a TikTok account, Wham Bam Dan Cam, and he's asking a question that many people may have already asked about fantasy names. Why are there so many repeat names? Well, that's because repetition happens in the real world, especially in monarchies when your name is your legacy. There are 2 Queen Elizabeths, 8 King Henrys, 3 King Charles, and that's just naming the immediate royals this American can think of. Passing down your name onto your children is a surefire way to create a lasting legacy for the family. According to Family Tree magazine, families across many cultures follow similar naming conventions, specifically naming your baby after a family member in a very specific order. Naming your baby after your favorite movie star or supermodel is a relatively modern trend. In England, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, you can expect to name your first son after your father's father, and the second son after the mother's father. The first daughter would be named after the mother's mother, and the second daughter would be named after the father's mother. If you had a third son or a daughter, only then would you name them after yourself or your spouse. However, naming conventions could be a way to honor your religious beliefs. French communities followed a similar pattern as the British, but they included a hyphenated first name, like Pierre-Marie or Jean-Luc, to honor religious figures. In Hispanic communities, naming conventions added another level by giving the child 1 or 2 extra names at their baptism. The fictional examples that we see in Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, Lord of the Rings, they're predominantly Western representing, but let's jump around the globe a little bit. In parts of Asia, including China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, the family name, or what Westerners would consider their last name, comes first, followed by your given name. In parts of India, it is common to use the father's first name as the middle name or last name, even though it is not universal. And in some states, official documents list the family name first, followed by a comma, and then the given names. Of course, this is just skimming the surface of naming conventions throughout the world. I've only touched on a handful of traditions. For example, in Vietnam, a person can have many names throughout the duration of their life, depending on their life's path and social status. Ultimately, however, names have meaning and cultural significance in your story, whether intentional or not. Many times we can see the cultural influences from the author. Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings are heavily influenced by events in European history, so it makes sense that the naming conventions would have a similar rhythm. These are all based on traditions, and as the world evolves, naming conventions change with it. LGBTQ and multicultural families, for example, would introduce opportunities to expand on these naming conventions and create new traditions. So for the writers listening today, how do you name your characters? Have you explored a naming convention that you have yet to see in real life? Share with us on Instagram or Twitter. Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.